Well, hello and welcome. It's hard to believe it's been not really 2 weeks. Our last interview was last week. Got a little off schedule, but it's hard to believe it's been another show since we've been here. My name is Guy Stevens. I'm the founder and executive director of the Alliance Against Seclusion and Restraint. Really happy to have you here today for our Alliance Against Seclusion and Restraint live series. Those of you that might not be familiar with the organization, the Alliance Against Seclusion and Restraint was formed about 3.5 years ago, really with the initial mission around the use of restraint and seclusion. We wanted to see the use of restraint and seclusion reduced and eliminated in schools throughout the country and even beyond. We wanted to provide a place that people that might have been going through these things knew that they weren't alone, that they could influence change. Ultimately, we want to see a change in policies, in hearts and minds, so that things like restraint and seclusion are reduced and eliminated. Additionally, restraint, seclusion, suspension, expulsion, corporal punishment, all the things that are often done to kids in the name of behavior. We believe there are far better things to do that are going to be better for the kids, the teachers, and the staff. So I am excited as always. I know I say I'm so excited today, but I always am. It's really exciting to have all the amazing guests that we have on this show. And I'm really excited today to have Rachel Hall with us, who I'll introduce here in just a moment. Rachel is going to share a little bit about her work and what she's doing in education. And I think it'll be inspiring to many of you that are out there. I think, there's a lot that we can learn from each other's and each other's stories. And this is another great opportunity to do that. Do want to let you know you're free to ask questions during the interview today. So this will be an interview format. Those of you that have been with us before, you know how that goes. I ask a lot of questions. And then as I see questions coming in from you, I try to bring those in as well. So you can put those questions in the chat, and we'll keep an eye on the chat during the conversation today. While we're talking about the chat, if you're already on, go ahead and introduce yourself in the chat. Tell us who you are and where you're from. And if you want to tell us more, feel welcome to as well. It's always fun to see where people are joining us from. We have a lot of people from here in the United States, but we also see people from Canada and Australia, New Zealand, and the UK. So it's fun to see where people are joining us from today. I do want to let you know, as always, the session is being recorded today. And that means that after the fact, if you have to leave early or you're not able to watch it live, it will be available on YouTube, Facebook, LinkedIn, and as always, as an audio podcast. So you have a lot of options there. I do have a couple announcements that I want to make prior to starting today. And I usually make announcements at the end. I will have a couple announcements at the end as well. But I just wanted to share a few things with you that I think are really important. One is we have an amazing event coming up. The event on October 14th is called Compliance to Compassion. And it's an event that we are doing in conjunction with the Attachment and Trauma Network. Tickets are available for that event. It's a full day virtual event. So you don't have to travel anywhere, but you do have to be ready to kind of be there for the full day. We've got a lot of fantastic sessions. We have people like James Moffat. We have Alfie Cohen. You know, if you've read his book, Punished by Rewards, Stuart Schenker and Susan Hopkins from Self-Reg. We've got Diane Curry from The Reset Process. We also have Norman Kunk and Emma Vandercliff talking about the person is not the problem is the problem. And we will be finishing the day with Jim Sporletter, who was our guest last week, talking about the Power of One. And if you recall, Jim was featured in the film Paper Tigers, talking about trauma-informed approaches and what they did at Lincoln High School in Walla Walla, Washington. In addition to our sessions, we have a number of fantastic sponsors sponsoring the event. You'll get to learn more about them as well. Supportable Solutions, the Maryland Developmental Disabilities Council, Communication First, Exceptional Needs Today, Help Me, Studio 3, the NORA Project, and the Trauma Informed Educators Network. So great event coming up. I will mention to you, if you'd like to go and you want a free ticket, there is actually an option for that as well. We are doing a giveaway over on the Alliance page. And if you go to the Alliance Against Seclusion and Restraint Facebook page, there is a post on the top of the page. And if you share, comment, and like that post, and make sure you leave your comment, you'll have an option to get a free ticket. And one final thing I will mention here before we get into our guests, if you enjoy these programs, I would encourage you to consider making a donation to the Alliance. We obviously spend a lot of time and energy making these programs and booking great guests. But this work is work that takes a lot of time and energy, as I'm sure that you can appreciate, and your donations can really be helpful to us. So with all that said, let me get to what you're really here about, not all these announcements. Let me introduce to you our guest today, Rachel Hall. And Rachel, it's great to see you. I'm going to give a little bit of your background here. So let me roll through this bio to tell people a little bit about who you are, and we're going to get into a conversation. And I do see that a number of people have already jumped into the chat as well to tell us where they're from. And again, if you're watching live, tell us who you are and where you're from in the chat. So let's meet Rachel. So since Rachel started her role as a director of education at Brook Lane Behavioral Services, and that's in Frederick, Maryland, correct?
Frederick and Hagerstown.
Frederick and Hagerstown. And that's why I always get confused, because I want to put you in two places. Rachel's been on a mission to reduce the use of restraint and seclusion. Actually, we first met when we had a grant through the Alliance to offer training to a couple of non-public schools in our state on the collaborative proactive solutions approach. And Rachel had applied on behalf of the schools and won an award, and actually went through some of the training that we did in collaboration with Lives in the Balance. Rachel joined Brook Lane Behavioral Services as the Director of Education in 2020. Wow, it's kind of right in the middle of the pandemic, right?
Yeah. True. Very true.
Yeah. So you're a pandemic director, if there is such a thing.
You haven't heard that one. Yeah.
We put it in front of everything else. You oversee 2 Type 1 special education schools in the state of Maryland. You received your Bachelor's of Science from Marshall University, where you spent time and played Division I volleyball. My daughter recently tried out for the volleyball team. She didn't make it, but I was excited that she tried out. Rachel received the 2012 Honors College Award for Outstanding Service in Psychology from clinical research conducted at the Mildred Mitchel-Bateman Psychiatric Hospital. Rachel then earned a master's degree in school, emphasized psychology. Rachel began her education journey working education as a teacher in a self-contained classroom with a primary disability of autism. She then spent 6 years at the Berkeley County Board of Education Special Education Office, where you provided intervention services, programming, eligibility, involvement for students in specific category of autism and behavior disorders. You worked with the therapeutic intervention practices and was a CPI trainer, also trained specifically in CPI interventions for students with autism, and assisted teachers in developing student-specific interventions and classroom therapeutic environments. You also coordinated and developed district-wide 504 plans and local Title IX oversight. Rachel is currently set to graduate from Harvard University with her certificate in advanced educational leadership in the spring of 2023. So that's a great background to give us an idea who you are. Rachel, I'm really excited to have you here, and I'll add to your introduction, something really important. A friend, Rachel, I consider you a colleague and friend. It's been great to get to know you and the work that you're doing. I'm glad we were able to meet through the work that you're doing to try to reduce the use of restraint and seclusion. So welcome, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for the introduction. That was great. Thank you. I'm really happy to be here. And we have so many conversations, so this kind of feels normal. So this is exciting. Yeah.
Right, that's right. And that's what we talk about. We've had all these conversations, and it's interesting because when you had applied for the grant and we started some conversations, and you kind of get deeper and deeper and realize, wow, we're really on the same page on so many things. So let me just share a couple of comments here real quick, and to my to my claim here, we in fact have somebody here from Australia. So Marion joining us from Australia, where it is. I'm gonna guess, I don't know where in Australia you are, but I know when we have people that join us from the East Coast, it's probably around 7 a.m. there, 6:30, 7:30, somewhere around that. So it is tomorrow already in Australia, and they are watching early in the morning. We've got someone here from Connecticut, Idaho, and there's been some stories recently in Idaho about the use of restraint and seclusion. A friend here from the UK, New Brunswick, Canada. You're going to think I'm paying these people to be here. and somebody else here from Canada, from Illinois. My non-speaking autistic child was restrained 9 times in less than 2 weeks. Gosh, Brooke, I'm really sorry to hear that. Numerous times he fell. Oh gosh, it's horrific. And Brooke, unfortunately, I relate to that from the experiences I had with my son, which is what led us to start the Alliance. Anyone that's been through this, at any time, feel free to reach out to us as well. We've got some thanks here to get us started as well. Rachel, thanks so much for your advocacy. And Nicole from New Jersey. So we've got a number of people that have joined us. And what I thought we'd do today, I call it an interview, but I think it's probably more of a conversation, is just kind of talk a little bit about, what you do, and your journey. And the journey to me is a really important part of our stories. I know myself, from where I started as a parent. I had a parenting journey. Where I started as a professional, I've certainly had a big journey recently. It's taken me on an entirely different course here, but I think our journeys are really important because, I'm a big believer in the idea that if we know better, we do better. And often our systems kind of get stuck doing things that we've always done. And it's really important to have people in leadership that help systems to get unstuck. And one of the things that really excites me about you and the work that you do is I would see you very much in that role of somebody that came in with a lot of ideas and a lot of energy. Change is hard. Change is difficult. But I know that you're one of those kind of change agents. So let's talk a little bit about your journey. And I know I read a pretty robust introduction there, but let's start with the beginning, and not too far back. But how did you get interested in education to start with?
So I would say, I kind of always loved working with kids. That's kind of where my sort of journey started. But I chose my school that I wanted to play volleyball at based on the programs. And I really wanted to be a speech pathologist to start. And then I changed my mind. So as I feel like college kid does at the time. So, I spent probably 2.5 years in the speech therapy program for communication disorders at Marshall University. So, I want to say I have to kind of go back into when that was, but I would say 3 semesters of sign language. So, and then when I kind of stopped my volleyball career, when I, had to figure out, I'm at that kind of crossroads, what am I going to do? I decided to stay at the campus I was at. I joined a sorority, and the sorority happened to be their philanthropic kind of, I guess what, they wanted to be a part of was Autism Speaks. So that's sort of where my journey started. And then I was just really far from home, and I wouldn't say I was bored, but I was just active. And I was like, how can I volunteer? What can I do? So I started working in a local high school in a self-contained autism classroom. When, Dynavoxes were big, and I was like, so curious, like, how do I learn more? Like, where can I get more involved? How can I help? Is sort of my first approach. So spent some time there. I ended up going into kind of doing more research at the psychiatric ward. So I spent time and I worked with adults, and I ended up working and doing case studies on adults with severe disabilities, with kind of low cognitive abilities. And then I realized, okay, am I too late? How can I help before this happens or before these kind of incidences happen? So that's kind of where I really got involved in wanting to figure out where my kind of journey started and where my career path was going to go. So I kind of came back home, applied for grad schools, and I got a call and they were like, we know you're home. How can you help us? So I worked with a student, actually. I'll call him Noah. So hypothetically, his name was Noah. So I went in the classroom with this student who was having a really hard time. I like to say non-vocal, not a non-verbal student. And I'll never forget, I was so intrigued with wanting to learn more. And I'll never forget the first day I went to work in the program. I was like, all right, I'm here. I'm ready. I've done the research. I'm so excited. And I turned around and I went to save his breakfast. And I kind of snuck in the refrigerator because I was like, I know he's not going to eat his breakfast. I'm just going to put this in here. And I turned around and he put my head right in the window. And I was like, whoo, okay. So I'm not knocked out. That's really good. And I turned back around and I was like, how can I help you? What can I do? Not I'm going to run away, but what can I do more? What did I do wrong? And the first thing was he can't tell me. So he might have wanted more juice. So I think that's just sort of where my journey kind of started and where I sort of started my career with wanting to work with those and advocate for people who can't necessarily advocate for themselves or don't know the tools. And that's kind of where I started.
I love the early, kind of realization there. And it's an important one, which is kind of, you're reflecting on the fact that, Noah wasn't able to really communicate to you what they wanted, but so often behavior is people focus on the behavior and, they focus on what has happened. without really kind of going to that deeper level of understanding. And you and I have talked a lot about behavior. We can get more into that a little bit later, but I think that was an important realization, wasn't it? To have this idea that there's something that this person needs,
Mhm.
rather than what did they do to me, or very often I think the idea is, well, that's not desirable behavior. How do we stop it? How do we control it? Rather than trying to understand what was that communicating.
Right.
Yeah. So certainly early in your career, you're making, I think, realizations that perhaps, sometimes people aren't making. I think, we've probably talked about this before, but there's that idea that people perceive all behavior as being intentional. All behavior is, yeah. I see that look you're giving me. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah. So important. So, you worked in the self-contained setting for how long?
I worked there for 2 years before I
Okay.
went to kind of working with also the students at the board office. Yeah.
Gotcha, gotcha. And of course, the hope is right in the future, and I think the thing we're always aiming for is, how do we have more inclusive environments and get, more students, with their peers, and, but certainly, there are programs that are helping kids that, are critical. So you are overseeing these two, what we would call in Maryland, non-public schools. Can you explain to people kind of what is a non-public school, and what's the role of a non-public school? Because I think some people here may not be familiar with it. It may be called something else in their state as well, or even their country. So, what is a non-public school, and what's the role of a non-public?
Sure. So I have two non-public special education, fully special education schools in the state of Maryland. So we're considered type 1 schools. So all of our students that are enrolled within our program, all are enrolled from public school locations, and they are students with IEPs. So they all have, disabilities in the areas of psychoeducational disabilities. So our role here is to give a more kind of therapeutic, more inclusive, more staffing, more resources that can help the students kind of bridge those gaps between what they might have lost in public school, and kind of do what we can do to kind of, like I said, bridge those gaps so they can go back with their typical peers,
Hmm.
basically,
Hmm.
in a
Hmm.
short version of a really long story.
Sure, sure. So the kids that you're working with are kids that have not been successful in less restrictive settings. Their teams, their IEP teams, have referred them for a non-public or a private placement, and then they may apply to your school, and depending on what their needs are and your availability of resources, then you might accept a student who comes in. Now, thinking about that, is a student comes in that has not had success in the public school system, I know from personal experience, when that student comes to you, that's a student that sometimes has had a very negative experience before they get to you. So how do you go about trying to transition someone in that may have had a really negative experience? I mean, you're sometimes talking about probably years of, uh, and I'll just be really blunt about it, but these are kids that sometimes have just not had their needs appropriately met, and they get to you and probably aren't terribly trusting, or don't feel terribly safe. How do you help to bring kids into your program? And I love that you talked about kind of the end goal is let's get them back out of this program with their peers. So how do you do that?
The first thing I like to do is bring them in by themselves. I like to let them meet the teachers before there's other students in the building. So if that's something that we can do, I find it pretty successful. I let them walk the school. So there's some predictability in the unpredictableness of what their first day might be. I give them a map of the location. I let them meet me. I let them meet Miss Nina, the principal, what their teachers might be like. And they can kind of see their classroom, get a good feel of what the building's going to look like. So then, like I said, the first day, there's going to be some kind of safe space that way because they know a little bit. So the first thing is, I like to start in smaller environments before we integrate into the classroom, because a lot of our students here, all of the students have had a, kind of an unfamiliar but similar experience to get to the school. So, there might be days where the dysregulation starts way before they get on the bus. So we know them by now when we don't necessarily know kind of the new students, only what we read on paper. And sometimes that's not always accurate.
Mhm.
So I like to kind of sort of start from scratch, get to know the students, have maybe a staff that they feel safe with. And the first thing is to make them feel safe, because we all know if they're not safe, they're not going to be successful academically if they don't feel that way. And perception's reality. If they're perceiving a thing that maybe is unfamiliar or, they're not safe in, it's their journey that way. So how can I help them make that journey into making them feel comfortable? So that's kind of where we start. I'll remember, I want to say last year, we actually had a kindergartner who was one of the first. We don't usually typically take kindergartners, but I remember the first day I was like, very active. And I said, okay, what do you want to do? And he's run. And I was like, okay. Then he just ran the hallways for a solid, probably, I was already winded by about 10 minutes and it was like 45 minutes. I was like, all right, let's go touch the door and then come back and then go back. But it was a half day of just playing, like just running in a safe space. But, there was no harm and he was happy to come back. So if that's what it takes, whether it's a week, 2 weeks, I have to kind of unshape some behaviors that have been so atypical for so long, that it might take some time before we're able to integrate into math, into science, into reading. Because like I said before, we want to make them feel safe and successful so they can go back with their peers.
That's fantastic. And I love your focus on safety. I think safety is so foundational, yet I'd venture to say, and based on our conversations, and my own experience, again, a lot of the kids that are coming through your doors are kids that have probably not had positive experiences, are potentially kids with trauma, generally kids with disabilities. And I think there's a lot of trauma related to disability as well. So gaining that, building that relationship, it's kind of the, we had an article one time written by one of the members of our community, and she titled it Regulation Before Education. We can't learn until we're able to, feel safe to, through co-regulation or whatever it may take to kind of get to that point. And, I think too, educators need to feel safe too, right?
Right.
An educator that doesn't feel safe can't effectively teach. So tell me a little bit about, and just a couple of quick questions here, I think that I saw. Let's see, somebody asked Victoria. Well, hello, Victoria. I haven't seen you in a while. Victoria, let's see, North Dakota, if I'm not mistaken. Victoria asked, is a non-public school a separate setting? I'll let you answer that.
It is. And we actually, so even though we're based in Maryland, we have students from different states. So we have students that are referred from West Virginia. We have students from Pennsylvania and, kind of longer locations from Maryland. So we're a separate location. We have our own school, own classrooms. Both of the campuses do. So yes, that is correct.
Okay. And Nicole from New Jersey asked where you're from, and if you wouldn't mind just sharing where you're from again.
So I am from West Virginia. So I spent my first, portion of my career in West Virginia. So now I am working in Maryland. So a little bit different, but not too far down 81.
Yeah, no, not at all. Not at all. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about, let me start here. When we met and, I'm trying to think, but it probably wasn't terribly long after you had started there. I'm trying to remember exactly when it was. But when we met, we met obviously because, you had applied for the grant that we were putting out about reducing, eliminating restraint and seclusion. And you were very excited and dedicated to that work. And even in your intro kind of talked about, that was one of your goals. One of the things that we know is that if we look at data across the state of Maryland, and Maryland's not unique here, there is often far more restraint and seclusion happening in non-public or private placements that are segregated special education placements. So when you came there and began talking about reducing restraint and seclusion, how did people initially respond?
That's a really good question. I would say, I'm pretty innovative, so I come with so many ideas. So I think, they were like, well, one, who is this? And two, I would say the first year that I started here, it was virtual. So last year was my full kind of first year of working with students, regulatory in the buildings. So I feel like, there was a lot of excitement from those that are engaged in making change, but sometimes change can be hard. And sometimes change becomes, a little unpredictable. So that's tying back into making sure you feel safe, which is also predictability. So that was a little challenging. But I would say, things were moving in a different direction in the state in general.
Mhm.
So I think people already kind of knew that within that sector. So that was obviously helpful on my end.
Yeah, yeah, and you say things are moving, and in fact, this year they moved a little further in terms of the legislation. So in Maryland earlier this spring, legislation was passed to eliminate seclusion in all our public schools, and really to try to close in on it happening less in our non-public schools. And you say that so matter of factly, like, well, people saw it changing, but I know, no offense towards any colleagues, but I know that not everybody's where you are. You are like, hey, this is a direction that we need to head. We need to do better here. But people sometimes hold on to what they're doing and can't imagine that they can do something different. So I think it's no small feat that you come in with this energy to say, we can do better. We can do something different. Tell me a little bit about how you got there. I mean, a lot of this, when you kind of really take it apart, it comes down to that story you shared very early on. And it comes down to almost the perception of behavior, the way you see yourself, and kind of your role in that as well. So, what kind of influenced your thought process in that really developed into your ideology, which, from what I know is, quite different than a lot of people's views on things like behavior. So tell me about kind of your philosophy on behavior and how you got there.
I guess I can start with, you are always, usually people are comfortable with their experiences and what they know, and I came from a state where seclusion wasn't legal. So this was a new experience for me. As far as seclusion in the state of West Virginia, that wasn't something that I had ever had an experience with in public school. So that was definitely different coming here. I agree with the philosophy and kind of what we've talked about before. Behavior is communication, but what don't I know? Communication is so many different factors. And I think, starting my career in kind of, students that are non-vocal, what else can I learn? And I think that's a different approach. I kind of do my leadership philosophy when it comes to like, what can I teach people? What can I help them learn? There's a big difference between, ignorance and insubordination. But if people don't have those tools to be able to learn and to grow and feel safe, then how am I going to expect them to capitalize on what I'm teaching them? So,
well, you mentioned curiosity, and curiosity, I think, is a really big one. I've been going through some training with the Merit Center, which is Stuart Shankard's organization, and they've got a fantastic, set of courses. It's kind of a foundations in self-reg. But one of the things that Shankar talks about a lot is kind of being a stress detective, right? Trying to understand like what's the underlying, what's the real cause of this, and again, there's often much more than meets the eye. But if we look at education, and we look at what often happens in our behavioral approaches in education, much of that is really based on behaviorism. A lot of it's based on the idea that, around operant conditioning and rewards and consequences, which I think, I'm not a huge fan of that approach. But even moreover, what we often see is that a kid's having a difficult time. A functional behavioral assessment happens. The child is observed. And then the reviewer might go back, and again, depending on who they are and what their background is, but they might go back and say, okay, well, let me determine the function of the behavior. And they're going to say, well, it was attention seeking, it was avoiding, it was escape, it was, access. And then they will come up with a theory. And then they will try to put that theory in place. Often it's a theory based on, positive rewards or some kind of consequence. And my reflections on that, for a lot of reasons, are a concern. One is that I don't believe those functions of behavior are really getting to the root of the problem. You mentioned earlier, like, well, what happened in the morning when they got on the bus, or what happened here? And often the kind of behavioral approach really just looks at, well, what was that function? I don't know how many times I heard my son was, attention seeking. Wasn't really the function of his behavior. And if you hold that against, you've gone through a tremendous amount of training yourself, but thinking about the training that you've been doing there with your team in collaborative proactive solutions, which looks at that much differently. So tell me and again, even at the end, I mean, what's missing from this whole process where, okay, we observe, we come up with a function, we come up with we look at the ABCs, right? We look at the antecedent behavior and then the consequence. And of course, what's missing from there, that the child is not involved in the process. It's strictly reward and consequence based. Tell me about kind of your approach and how that's different than, what we so often see in a lot of the behavioral approaches.
I had to think about this a little bit and realize kind of what's normal to me, which might not be normal to everybody else in their process. But I really take a step back and I think of, we're spending so much time observing the kid, but we're not observing the environment. I've walked into classrooms numerous and numerous times and I'm like, I'm what's considered neurotypical, if that's what they would say. And I'm like, I'm even overstimulated. There's too much visual imagery on the wall. There's too many things. And if I can't regulate myself, how am I going to give somebody else these expectations? So that's what I really try to teach, the staff here on. Let's start from scratch. Let's look at the environment. How can we manipulate the environment to help support the kids? And that was a big behavior change, I think, just for the staff. We painted classrooms, there was walls, different colors. There was carpet, different colors. There was just so many things. And we started from scratch. We said, if we have students kind of facing the board and ready to learn, I said, why do they have to turn around and see their work on the back wall? It should be in the front, depending on what type of motivational learner that they are. But starting from there, what's the temperature of the room? Who's in the room, because there's so many variables that are outliers that, have such an impact on what we would typically see as behavior that we don't consider when we're writing FBAs, we're writing VIPs, we're doing goals. Is it a staff? I'll never forget. I had a student who I was trying to figure out, like, what is it with lunch? Like, he just really doesn't want to go. That's good if we don't go. But, I was taking him for walks and I was just really trying to figure out, he couldn't necessarily tell me. And then all of a sudden it kind of clicked. His olfactory sense was so much higher than mine. He hated broccoli. Broccoli stunk. It was awful. He wanted no parts of going. So I was like, ding, ding, ding. What in that environment can I change? And I was like, okay, we just won't go to the cafeteria for lunch. Like, we won't have broccoli if that's so aversive to you. And I think that's hard for staff to really understand and take a step back. If that's not impacting me, how do I understand? So what we started with, or kind of what I introduced, was, a different way to take data, a different way to observe, a different way to share that data with other staff by looking at the environment. Where is the student sitting? Who's beside him? What's the proximity? Is it hot in the classroom? What kid wants to learn in a really warm classroom? Not me, and none of my friends that go here, I wouldn't think. But, things like that really kind of start at the root of, do they feel safe? Are they comforted? Have they eaten breakfast? I don't, a lot of my students that come to the schools, their home structure is so inconsistent, and I'm not going to have them come in the building and me treat them like they're a kid when they're playing mom and dad all day long. So that lack of, they want some control. They want to feel like they're heard. And kind of starting from there, before I start collecting antecedents, I might not know. So what can I tell each other? What can we have conversation around that's really going to impact the student? And I think that makes a big difference.
Yeah. I love that you start it with environment, because it's so often overlooked. I was having a conversation with occupational therapist Greg Santucci one day, and we were on this program actually, and suddenly as Greg's talking, this thought hit me like a train. It's like, we should be doing functional environmental assessments before we're doing behavioral assessments. We should really look at the environment, understand, again, it's that stress detective idea, right? It's that idea of looking at what might be making it difficult. We all have this tolerance. And when our tolerance is exceeded, that's when we're going to see communication, we're going to see behavior, we're going to see a lot of things. And the other thing I think that's really important, and I'm sure that's something that's probably, it's intuitive to you. It's intuitive to you because this has been your approach, but it's not always intuitive to everybody. We often want to control, and we want people to comply. And our education systems are often very much bent in that direction. So getting people to realize even their own impact, right? So, I think you're probably somebody that's very intuitive when it comes to your own impact. But, when I learned as a father of a neurodivergent son, how important my demeanor, my voice, my eyes, all of those things were in either escalating or helping a situation. And when you realize that, it's a real game changer. But people often don't realize their own impact. And I'm sure that's something that for you, I mean, how do you bring staff to that point? I mean, again, I think, from a very early point, you got this. But, the system is not tuned in that direction. So how do you get people to kind of make that realization?
I think it's empathy. It's empathy to give ourselves. I feel like sometimes, it's a hard to work in sometimes this environment because you become so attached to the kids. You've
Mhm.
had them for years, and then it's kind of obviously I know you need to be sent back, but I want to keep helping. And I think that's a big part of it. And I think it's just really being able to tap into yourself, know where your boundaries lie, know where, and it's okay. If today is not the day and you don't feel like you're able to give your 100%, that's all good. Tap
Right,
out. Let's go over here. Let's try this. And I
right,
think
right,
being able to vocalize, no one's perfect. And
right.
if you're able to articulate that, today's maybe not your day, you're going to give me more for the student than what you would if you went somewhere and you weren't going to be therapeutic, you weren't going to be empathetic.
Right.
And everybody has a bad day.
Mhm.
There's curves in the road. So I think really starting with that and then knowing your own limitations, and having time between staff to really process. I find that can be really challenging because there's some really kind of heavy trauma, heavy emotions that, you take home with you. I catch
Mhm.
myself sometimes driving home in the car and I'm like, oh, it's already been 30 minutes. I'm already home and I didn't listen to any music. You just become
Right, right.
rhythmic with it. But I think really processing with your colleagues and, if this was easy, there'd already be a book, right?
Right,
Like if
right.
this was easy and this was, end all be all for each student, then we would have that. But we have to be able to be willing to kind of have trial and error, to know what's successful. And one thing that might be successful yesterday might not work tomorrow, and that's okay. But let's kind of collect our toolbox and let's try and let's talk about it,
Mhm.
and then involve the student. So I think going back to the empathy perspective, the communication perspective, and really tapping into yourself and learning how to process within. And that can be really challenging, to admit kind of not what your faults are, but what your strengths are not,
Mhm, mhm,
if
mhm.
that makes sense. So, I know for me, I'm pretty desensitized to the process, which is definitely pros and cons that way. But one
Mhm.
thing early in my career, when I was in kind of acute, situations, I started talking really fast. I didn't even realize I was doing it. So I had to kind of, step back and I started actually teaching myself. I started singing like what Baby Shark in my head because I was like, whatever they're saying to me is not good. I'm not going to take it home. Right. So I think being able to teach yourself and, at the end of the day, like, I'm going to come back tomorrow, but I need to be ready to come back tomorrow, not
Right,
just for me, but
right.
for the kids.
Mhm.
So how can we process that with each other, and be ready for the next day?
So have you started the book yet?
Which one?
Well, you said that there's not a book out there yet, so,
No, I really
I mean,
don't
I think we should start on it, we need that. Let me get
Right.
to a question here real quick. This is from, my friend Sandra, who is in North Carolina, an amazing advocate that's been advocating to end seclusion in, her district. The argument that, she keeps hearing is that, we have to seclude and restrain kids for safety. What's your response to this, and what advice would you have to help staff understand there are other options?
I think going back to the tools, right? In that very kind of what I said before, is it ignorance to know what works or what tools that there are versus, am I just today I'm not having a good day? And I think taking the time to really teach staff, what your tools are, what can you do, and really focusing with them to understand like you have some really good skills. Let's use them.
Mhm.
Right.
Mhm.
And if this is a situation where you're not comfortable and tap out, let's switch out. I like to tell my staff, I'm not going to tell you to do something that I wouldn't do. If you need
Right,
my help, I will toilet. I will
right.
go in the classroom. I will model. And I think taking the time to do that, sometimes, at least my experience in public school, there's not enough hours in the day,
Mhm, mhm.
and it comes to 3:30 and staff are so burnt out. And that's not the solution, but what tools can I give them? What books do they want to read?
Mhm,
One of the things that we've shared with staff, Vanderbilt puts out iris models. They're quick tools that are very, I like to say sometimes written in crayon. They're not super, large vocabulary. They're very basic, but, I think explaining to staff that, there's other ways that you can approach, behavior, or the kids are trying to tell me something, right? They might not be using the right words, but do they understand what I'm saying? And I can't react to that in a way until they're at their kind of safe space, right? Kind of what we talked about before. We can have, and I think, taking away the punitiveness and the control, just like you said, how are we going to maximize the hierarchy to figure out, what's so important right now to get these kids to feel safe and get them to learn? I'll never forget working in classrooms, and I would have teachers that have a very kind of old school methodology on, I sit down, I have paper, and my first thing in my mind is like, okay, these students have ADHD and you're giving them white pieces of paper, right? Like, do you can get a different color? What about blue? What about a highlighter? Like little things like that, maybe they don't even realize. So I want to give them those tools to be able to help.
So let me take the question in a little different direction. In doing the work that I've been doing over the last few years, I often hear this idea of tools and strategies. And there are a lot of things out there. I mean, I think about, a tool or strategy like collaborative proactive solutions, or, there's a lot of things out there that I think can be really helpful. But I've kind of reached this point in my mind where I think the biggest change that needs to happen is not the tool or the strategy, but it's a philosophical change, right? It's the mindset change, because I'm a big believer, like, even if you just make the decision, you're not going to do this anymore, you're not going to seclude kids anymore, the power of that is significant. But that's one of the harder things to make. It's the kind of the culture and whatnot. How do you get people there? I mean, again, it's one thing to say, well, here's a tool, you can do it differently, but how do you help people? And thinking back to, as you've been advocating for, changes to reduce, eliminate restraint and seclusion, again, some people probably have had that mindset, like, oh, we got to do this. We don't like doing it, but we have to do it. So how do you influence? And I know part of the answer to that because I know you, and it's the positive and it's the manner which you take your message forward. But are there other things that you find useful in getting people to make that mind shift change?
I think time, like I said before, the processing. I would be in situations when we first started adapting this change, and I will say, our seclusion to restraint, when I looked at the data, they've gone down almost 65 to 70%, which is very large for the amount of students that we have. I hope to continue to keep going down. But I will say, processing, I like to ask why, right? So they want to know, behaviors to one person is going to be so different based on experience to somebody else. So I had a staff member out that came to me to kind of process through, which I always open conversation, open dialogue. There's a student sitting in the staff chair, like, they won't get out. And you know what I said? I was like, okay, why was it there? How was it open? Right? Like, they're going to get up eventually. Like, they're going to go to lunch. They're going to go to gym class. But what's it matter? Right? Like, is that if they're sitting, if they're engaging, if they're participating, it's a chair with wheels, so little things like that. And I think being able to take the time to process with people, because I'd rather them ask me than just assume. And let's talk it through. Tell me what your philosophy is. I'll tell you mine. And then let's explain the rationale behind it. And I think that's been really helpful to people, because if you don't take the time to explain, then you're not helping the ignorance to the process, because maybe they just don't know, or maybe all that they know is what they're used to.
Right. Well, I've always said that if you don't know another solution, you can't imagine it, right? If this is what you've always done, in your mind, there's nothing else, you would have done it if there was something else. So sometimes it takes that finding the something else, or knowing there's another way. So can you tell me a little bit about, so we did this grant program with you guys, and that was really to provide some training around collaborative proactive solutions. Can you tell me a little bit about the experience that you guys had with that, and kind of what kind of influence or difference that's made in what you've been doing?
It was, when we first started the program, I kind of went back to that, my innovative kind of ideas sort of being new. And they were like, okay, here we go with the book study, right? Like, she's giving us more stuff to read. They actually someone asked me, which I kind of really enjoyed it, but do you dream of spreadsheets and ideas? And I was like, I probably do. I put a notebook by my bed. But, starting that process, I think we started with a video. And I really, the staff and the paraprofessionals, sometimes we need just as much as the students, right?
Mm-hmm.
Not everyone learns the same. You know, applying that approach to staff, just like we apply it to the students, has been really helpful. I even know for me, I'm such a visual learner. You know, I like to write things down. So we started with an open dialogue with you, Guy, and then we moved to watching the documentary, which was extremely moving to a lot of people. So I started with that because I really believe, you know, if you don't have buy-in to the program and if you don't have buy-in to the change, there's going to be resistance, right? You know, and you're not going to be as proactive. So starting with that has been really helpful. I kind of watched the documentary and I participated with the staff too. So we watched the documentary and then I kind of gave them a week or two to just sort of take it in. And I sort of walked around sort of trying to listen in on conversations. And, you know, one thing I heard was they were talking about it, right? And that's was step one. So engaging in the conversation. And, you know, I had some staff that I kind of handpicked to be a part of the book study and I gave them the why. And I'll never forget, you know, I had a list of 8, right? And then we get done the documentary and I almost had a list of 30. And it was in the summer. So I was like, okay. There's some type of movement happening. And, you know, I think starting with the books, you know, if they wanted a book, I bought it. You know, we had a couple and I was like, all right, we're getting on target. We're adding more on there, which was super helpful. So, you know, and I think spending some time, you know, we get professionals in this field, especially our school, which may not have experience in the public sector, which can sometimes be challenging too, because they don't really fully understand the process of what it takes for a student to get here. So that was one thing that I took the time to explain. You know, we made handbooks. I'll also never forget, I ended up giving one of my colleagues a tour of the school and I realized we got done and I was like, I just talked in 3-letter acronyms. He had no idea what I was saying, right? Like I live in the special ed world, I speak in acronyms. And so I made that for them. I said, okay, well, how can I start from the beginning? And that was really helpful. You know, processing through the book, it really took away some of the punitiveness because it gave other examples outside of what they know, which was really nice. You know, and it also kind of, you know, I sit back and reflect, and it's something I normally do, right? I have conversations with kids. I want them to tell me what they want, give me the buy-in, but that's not everyone. So I will say, you know, the desire to make the change after reading that was really positive. And they came in my office, what else do you have? Like, do you have other books? Like, and I was like, all right, here we go. And then I forgot to write them down. So I've lost all my materials, but, you know,
I got a list of books for you. Don't worry.
Yeah. But so excited to learn. They were like sponges.
Yeah.
Which was really positive to me because it kind of gave me some more motivation to make some changes, which was nice.
So I put a link in the chat. The film that we started out with was The Kids We Lose, which is a film that talks about restraint and seclusion and really the impact it has on kids, on families, on staff. And of course, it's a tough watch too, if you have experience around these areas. So we did that. And I remember we did a discussion with the group, and it was a bigger group initially for that. And we went into the book study. And of course, that was the book Lost at School. By Dr. Ross Green. We went through the book study and I got to facilitate that. And that was a lot of fun. And, you know, I remember starting the book study and, you know, you could kind of tell different people were in different places or had different beliefs. But it turned into, we did that every week for a few weeks, or I don't remember how many sessions it was, but, you know, I remember seeing people kind of shift along the way, or people that didn't really seem to be buying into things at first that, you know, suddenly were asking really great questions. And it was a really great process. And then, of course, you later began training with Lives in the Balance. And, you know, I know you're still completing that training now. But it sounds like from your experience that there was some positive shift made. And certainly, you know, we can't attribute it all to this, but I think your leadership and then bringing in things like this for your staff have certainly probably helped with that journey, I would assume.
Absolutely. And giving them the tools, you know, people don't know what they don't know. So, you know, me going to staff and, you know, saying, hey, this book is really great. I've already read it. I think you're going to like it. Do you want a copy?
Right.
Sure.
Right.
You know, and, you know, if you lead them, like they say, what is it? Lead a fish to water. Hopefully they'll drink or something like that. I probably butchered that.
I think, of course, fish already live in water, but that's okay.
Something like that. Maybe not fish to water, whatever it is. But, you know, I had to lead them to knowing the material. They didn't even know where to look.
Right.
So we
Right.
had to kind of start that way and start small and then eventually keep growing. And, we got more engagement. I started hearing more conversations with students, which was what I wanted to hear. In the book, they kind of, one of the opening dialogues is, how do you approach kids? It's not kind of, verbatim, hello, how are you? Is it
Right.
a good
Right.
morning? It's like, hey, what's up? Right.
Right.
I say
Right.
that anyways. Like the
Right.
kids,
Right.
I'm at that age where they're like, okay, you're not really my mom, but you're still kind of cool, but maybe not so. And, hearing that from, the different age groups of staff that we have here has been really nice to hear.
Right.
They're greeting students by name every morning. And I would
Doesn't that
say,
make a difference? Right. Right.
right. Like, I know every one of their names. I'm like, tell me what you like. Like, what basketball team do you like? If I don't know, you best bet I'm Googling later. I'm going to figure it out. Like, I have
Yeah.
no idea who's in the, baseball World Series, but I'm going to figure it out. So like little things like that, like, let's talk, tell me more.
Connection. Right. I mean, all of that. I mean, it's authentic connection. And, I mean, again, I think we all do the best work for the people that we like. When you're connecting with people and building relationships with people, they want to please you. They don't want to disappoint you. When you demand compliance, it's a totally different story, so I mean, building those relationships. So tell me about, trauma informed or kind of neuroscience. What's your kind of background and kind of trauma informed approaches and kind of, knowing what's going on in the brain, and how has that helped you, or how have you been able to kind of help your staff around those areas as well?
So, I did a lot of research before on sensory regulation. I'm a big proponent on, how can I regulate the environment? What tools can I give the student to be able to create their own journey? Right. We're in that kind of the school sector. I might not know about medications. Sometimes I call the parent and they don't answer. Right. Or I don't have engagement from parents. So what can I do to help this student already? Like I said, visual imagery, kind of taking away some of the, overstimulation in those classrooms it's been night and day. Making it available for students to learn has been really, really important. The communication, I kind of brought the verbiage of, my friends aren't not nonverbal, they're non-vocal, right? Like,
Right.
they understand the process. Those Wernicke's and Broca's connections might not necessarily be there, but I don't know that based on the psychoeducational evaluation, right? I don't want to assume. So let's, talk to the kids as if we're having conversations with each other, ask them questions, talk to them, spend time with them, and I hope to kind of create more synapses in those relationships with the kids, which is, successful in the long run. So sensory regulation has been a big part of my career. Visual imagery, somatization. I use that a lot, and that was one of the things I didn't necessarily appreciate about seclusion, right? It's really stoic. It's really dry. And, there's white walls, right? What kid is going to regulate in nothing they can see to calm them down? So how can I create a safe space outside of the classroom, whether that be in the front lobby, whether that be in kind of an alternative classroom, or, we have an atrium and gyms at both locations. So what can I put there to kind of help them, regulate themselves? That's fun. We have sensory walks, we have letters on the wall. I'm in the process of painting what was seclusion rooms, with kind of, calming sort of systematic colors, systematic frames to hopefully assist in, some of those things that can help calm the students. And I try to reflect and share with staff, we all have experiences, right? And students have experiences at home, and I never want to take away, a student trying to self-regulate, right? If a student needs to walk out of class, I would rather them walk out of class than throw something, right? Let's let them walk out of class.
Right.
Let's let them take a couple times. Think about it at home. You're cooking in the kitchen. That's your safe space. You might have a disagreement. Where do people go? Their bedrooms, right? That is normal to these kids. So how can I tie, that kind of home school environment together and
avoid the power struggle too, right? Because it's the power struggle where things, it's the sometimes asking the question of, do I need to control this, right? If a kid needs to walk out because they need a quiet space, then like you said, that may be the best thing to do. Or getting them for a walk outside. Or you mentioned earlier, as we were talking before we started here, about the project that you have for the, I think it was you mentioned seniors in a room that you were going to build for them, with Xboxes and all sorts of great stuff. but again, I think, the idea that a lot of this happens under the guise of compliance and, power struggles, and it's not benefiting anybody. It's not benefiting the educators. It's not benefiting kids, so a lot is changing mindset, you know,
Right.
um, sometimes even asking the question of, is this something, um, sometimes as adults, we get caught up on, whatever it is that we want to enforce, but does it really matter?
Right.
Sometimes it doesn't. And why lead to an escalation? And, when we look at restraint and seclusion, we often see that these things begin around a demand that kids having a hard time meeting, and they escalate. I mean, and you shouldn't escalate from failure to do a worksheet to being restrained on the floor. I mean, it
Right.
just shouldn't happen, but, unfortunately sometimes does. I want to get back to, I know, in fact, I know we have some other administrators watching, because I saw a few minutes ago, we've got a wonderful administrator from New Zealand who we actually, Linda, who we interviewed previously. Linda brought the neurosequential model of education and has done a lot of fantastic work. But let's imagine for a moment the administrator, and this could be a superintendent, it could be a principal, it could be somebody in a role like yours, but that is resistant to change, that has heard from staff, we need these seclusion spaces. Restraint is, and we hear this. We hear
Mhm.
things like restraint is safe and therapeutic. Um, what would your advice be to an administrator that is kind of stuck, and how might you encourage them to consider other options?
I think the research, kind of like what you said, bringing those tools to the table and, tell me why, right? I don't want to be punitive to staff just the way I don't want to be punitive to kids.
Right.
What theory is misaligning with the ultimate mission? So why do you feel like it's important, right? And I think getting to that root of belief based on that administrator's experience is really going to be telling to kind of align with their journey and getting away from being, punitive. And I think a lot of the times, like you said, it involves around control,
Right.
and what are we trying to control? Right. I think too, I like to say a lot of the time, if I can give 20 and get back 40, I have a solid, math lesson, or I have a solid reading lesson, or, I'd rather give 20 than have a student not be in the academic setting. So
Mhm.
I think going back to the tools, looking at the research, and I feel like even in being an in administration myself, right? I love research. Maybe that's just me, but I really
Your
like.
spreadsheets, right?
I know, right? But I really like the research. I like to know what worked and what didn't work. But I
Yeah.
also really enjoy my own experience because
Right.
I want to learn anatomically and to be able to share that with other
Mhm,
people. So
mhm.
I think starting with the why is really important.
Yeah. So I know I promised you have an important dinner to get off to, and I promised you that we would keep it in an hour, and we're almost there. If there's any final question out there from the audience, feel free to put it in the chat now. But we're going to be wrapping up here in just a moment, so that you can go and enjoy a nice dinner. Um, any final words of wisdom for parents, for educators, for anyone, based on your journey?
I would definitely say it's better to ask than assume.
Hmm.
I would
Hmm.
much rather spend time asking and getting to know the students than just assuming. And it's very easy to assume the journey based on their experiences, but I've not been involved. So what can I gather to not make assumptions to make these kids successful? And I feel like that's where we really don't spend enough time.
Right.
We
Right.
spend a lot of time reading 60, 70-page documents, but we don't spend enough time talking. We don't spend enough time building rapport. We
Mhm.
don't spend enough time making the kids feel safe. And if
Mhm.
we can do all those things, tying back to the hierarchy of needs, then they're going to be at the baseline to learn because I don't know what goes on at home. I
Mhm.
don't want to assume, but I want to know when they walk through the door that they're comfortable, that they're
Right.
safe, and that
Right.
they can learn.
And I've heard from educators before, kind of the idea that, well, only part of their day is with me, and we don't have any control over what happens at home, and almost as if, well, because of that I can't do anything. And I always kind of come back to that with, kids are at school a lot, and if that school can be the one safe place for that kid, you may be saving a kid. And I don't believe we should give up on any kid, and that's how you do it. Well, listen, it is just about time for us here. I'm going to, as I promised, let you go. I've got a quick announcement here for everybody else. but I'm going to let you go. But Rachel, I want to thank you again for coming on with us today. Always a pleasure to talk to you. And we're going to get your restraint and seclusion down to 0. And love to do more collaboration with you. But thank you so much for all that you're doing. And we will talk to you again sometime.
Thanks so much for having me, Guy. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. And enjoy your dinner.
Thanks, guys.
All right. Take care. So for everybody else, just a couple quick announcements here. So bear with me as I share my screen. I hope you enjoyed that conversation. Again, it's always so valuable in my mind to, meet people that are on journeys, whether they're, in education, whether they're parents, whether, they're in any other way kind of involved with these things that we're working with. So I did want to let you know for our next live event, that will be 2 weeks from today. We're going to be talking to James Moffett, and James is going to be talking about creating a fully functioning trauma-informed school. So that should be a really great conversation. So put that on your calendar. Be sure to join us for that. And until next time, thank you all for joining us today. And I look forward to seeing you again next time. Thanks. Bye-bye.